talking, and we'll leave some time at the end to answer them. If we don't have enough time to get through to all the questions, we'll reply to participants by email within the next 5 to 7 days. We encourage you to ask questions or simply share a comment. Today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center during 2017 and 2018. This is a new technical assistance center funded by the Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. The two communities of practice referred to in the center's mission referred to in the center's mission are focused on the 30 national My Brother's Keeper Success Mentor sites and the many STIG and STIG eligible schools throughout the country that are working to implement early warning system programs to address chronic absenteeism. Although we have run into several unanticipated delays in launching the TA Center website, we are pleased to announce that we recently took a significant step forward in this process, and we hope that the site will be live very soon. Today's webinar is being presented by Paul Verstraete. Paul has a master's in teaching curriculum and a master's degree in educational technology from Michigan State University. Paul is the facilitator for the School and Student Support Services Division at Talent Development Secondary Everyone Graduate Center at Johns Hopkins University. He has worked for Johns Hopkins as an early warning indicator facilitator, supporting middle and high school implementation of the model in various cities across the country, concentrating on early warning systems and tiered interventions. Nationally, he provides professional development on dashboard data analysis, tiered interventions, and use of common planning time. Paul, I pass things over to you now.
Oops. All right, thank you so much. Sorry about that, I was on mute for a second there. I want to start by saying that for the rest of this presentation, we titled this for parents and guardians, but I'm going to be shortening that to just parents, using the broader definition of that term, parent, to be or act as a mother or father to someone. Not only for simplicity's sake, but around the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. From there, to understand how to connect to parents to the early warning systems, I'm going to be giving a brief intro to EWS as a foundation of our discussion, after which I'm going to take a short detour into understanding the difference between reaching out versus bringing in parents. And from there, I'm going to be handing it off to my colleague, Jennifer Sarang, who has had extensive experience in building such systems at the schools that she's worked at. And I'm also going to have to ask our facilitator, Dantel, to be moving the slides for me because I have a pretty shaky internet connection here. So Dantel, if you don't mind moving on to that next slide for me, which is the picture of me. That's me. As Dantel said, I am the National Early Warning System Facilitator for Talent Development Secondary, a part of Johns Hopkins University. If we can move on to the next one, and to give a brief definition of what I mean by EWS, and its focus on data. Early warning systems is all about data, and it's designed to identify those students who are at risk, who are signaling through their data that they are disengaging and maybe heading away from that goal of crossing that graduation stage towards leaving school altogether. We can move on to the next slide. This data, known as the ABCs, consists of a student's attendance, behavior, and course performance. On the graph, you can see that as A, B, and then E and M are English and math grades. So this graph that you see before you represents students in the 6th grade more than a decade ago who had trouble in attendance, behavior, English, and math, and where they ended up in their path towards graduation, and how over the years, just by looking at that data in their 6th grade, they were not in 7th grade when they were supposed to be. A large portion of them were not. They were not in 10th grade when they were supposed to be, a large portion of them. And so you can see over the years of all of those kids who had trouble in the ABCs, more and more of them kept falling further and further behind. If we can move on to the next slide. From this data, we build a system of tiered interventions. This system is taken from the public health model and is the most efficient and impactful method of utilizing scarce resources. And we as educators all know what that means to have to utilize scarce resources. And so from that base, moving on to the next slide, of Tier 1, developing a positive school culture through whole school programs and initiatives that affect all students, to the pinnacle, moving on to the next slide, where we're focusing more on those individual high-need students, providing case-managed direct support to meet their needs. And then if we combine the two, if we move on to the next, is when we kind of build a Venn diagram to be able to understand that middle section of the pyramid, where we take the project management aspect of Tier 1, and if we move on to the next slide, we kind of add to it that case management aspect of Tier 3, and moving on to the next slide, that kind of equals those targeted supports. We're building these initiatives and these groups of students to then provide them support around common issues that they all share. So in a lot of ways, those Tier 2 targeted supports are kind of that mix of project and case management. And then if we move on to the next slide, we have ourselves the final, and in many ways for myself, the most important component of an early warning system is the people who champion our students, those who work to lead those Tier 1 initiatives and targeted supports. And without those champions, that the data and interventions are they're just good ideas that we have, but it's the champions who actually bring them to our students and use them to affect their lives. And so if we move on to the next, this is when we kind of add it all together. So if we take that ABC data, which we can use at the very beginning and to identify students who are in trouble, and that research that was done more than a decade ago has been replicated across the country, by the way, from kindergarten all the way up to high school in every region of the country, and in suburban, urban, and rural areas. So that ABC data was groundbreaking and has become skyscraping since that original study. And so if we add to that, next slide, those tiered interventions that I was talking about, those targeted whole school and intensive one-on-one supports, and then we add on, next slide, those people that are doing the work, that are championing our students, we finally get to our definition of what an early warning system is, moving on to that, to the next slide. So that's what we mean by building an EWS. So that's the framework that we're going to be talking about reaching out to our parents in. We're going to be talking about reaching out to them to support the ABCs, reaching out to them in a tiered fashion, and reaching out to them as teams and bringing them in. So if we move on to the next slide, this is when I take that detour to talk about the difference between reaching out versus bringing in. And to understand the difference between the two, I want to start with a quote that I have heard, and I have to admit I have said myself many times. And that is, next slide, that I can't do anything if they don't show up. It's common for teachers all over the country that we say this. I've heard it asked as a question. Move on to the next slide. What can I do if they're not there? It's these questions, and if we take these two statements at face value, it's an admission that we care about our students but feel powerless to support them. We want them to succeed but feel like we can't do it if they're not there for us to help them succeed. It is that cry from our teachers that we want them there for their success, but we feel limited in being able to provide that success. And so the really funny, and by funny I mean kind of ironic thing, is that the next statement, if you move on to the next slide, is also that we say I called home whenever we have problems with our students in our classroom, where we are saying like, oh, this student I was having trouble with this student in the classroom, and so I called home, and somehow hoping that by calling home, their parents would somehow change their behavior in my classroom, even though they are at home. Which then, if we move on to the next slide, is all about the difference between that school building and that home where those students live. And it's a great way to visualize that difference between my area of concern, the things that I am worried about as a teacher, my students and their success, or as a parent, my students and their success. And so I want to use these two symbols of a school and a home to kind of visualize that. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see that our influence kind of fades the further and further away we get from those students get from our classrooms. It fades further and further they get away from our hallways and our lunchrooms and from the building grounds when they walk out those doors. We still have a little bit of influence, but it fades as both time and distance. And if we move on to the next slide, we have to admit that the same thing is true of our parents. That as that student is spending less and less time in the house and is spending further and further away from the parents, their influence over that child fades as well. And so what we end up with, if we move on to the next slide, is that assuming that we both have this great concern over our students and their success, that there is this gap between our influence, that we care for their success and want to make sure that they succeed, but there's this gap that we need to build a bridge, which is the next slide. Build a bridge between those two spheres of influence to support that student's success. Which means going back to our EWS and the ABCs as predictors of future success, we want to build that bridge to increase that student engagement. We want to build that bridge to make sure students show up, to make sure that they know how to behave in the classrooms and how to take and how to do the work, because as we saw in that original graph, students who have poor attendance, poor behavior, and poor course performance are not creating that momentum to make it to graduation day. And so we want to build that bridge. And so if we move on to the next slide, what I mean by building that bridge is that it's, oh, I'm sorry, if we can go back to the previous slide, sorry, is that we want to reach out across that bridge to our parents. We want so that we can bring them in. Now, we don't want to assume that they have influence that they don't have. That when we reach out to them, we want parents to use their influence that they have in the home. When we reach out to them, that reaching out is more about bringing our classrooms and the needs of our classrooms into their home rather than trying to bring their influence into the school, which is what bringing them in is. And so it is on these two sides of the coin that we are talking about connecting with parents. We want to be able to support them and when they are working from home to support their kids, give them concrete ideas to help their kids when they're bringing home homework, give them concrete ideas to help their student organize their behaviors at home, to do that homework or to study. We want to be able to reach out to them with that support, so therefore our classroom is in a sense brought into their homes. And when we bring them in, when we do the reverse of that, when we bring them in, I am talking about physically bringing them into the building, so therefore they bring that influence that they have over their child with them into the building. And that's the only time that we can fairly say that we want that parent to influence their child's behavior in our building is when they are physically there, when they are a part of our community. And so if we move on to the next slide, going back to the EWS, that is what we're talking about when it comes into reaching out and bringing them in. The next slide, and equaling connecting with parents. So we want to do the ABCs, as I was saying. We want to do that in a tiered fashion, reaching out to our parents. So if we go down to the next slide, when we're connecting with parents, we're doing it so that we can increase engagement. Next slide. We're talking about it so that way we can do it efficiently. When we reach out to parents, we are utilizing resources, and we have to make sure that the resources we're utilizing could not be better spent elsewhere. And if we move on to the next slide, we want to make sure that we make that connection personal between the teachers in our building and the staff members in our building to the people, to the parents in the schools, to the parents at home, I mean. We want to make that a personal connection. And so if we move on to the next slide, we also want to acknowledge that sphere of influence and concern, that we all have concern for the success of our students, as well as acknowledging that our influence fades the further and further they get physically from our classrooms or time spent in our classrooms, the same physically away from the homes and time spent in the homes, that our influence fades. And so, going to the next slide, it's within this framework in mind that I'm going to be handing this presentation over to my colleague to share some of those best practices that she has done so well working with the schools that she has worked with. Moving on to the next slide, how she has worked with schools and with parents and communities to build that bridge. So without further ado, next slide, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jennifer Zarang, who is going to talk exactly about that, what she has done.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and I am excited to be a part of this presentation with the National Student Attendance, Engagement, and Success Center. As schools tackle parent-community engagement, it is first important to understand what will appeal to your stakeholders, as well as assess the current status with engagement practices on campus. We really need to consider how many kids come from single-parent households, what percentage of grandparents are serving as guardians, how many of our students are in foster care, and who is that supportive adult that is serving as a guiding force in their lives. Another thing we need to consider is the success and challenges to parent and community engagement, and how we have or haven't used that information to develop more engaging efforts for stakeholders. Another thing is, what groups or structures currently exist on your campus that can take this torch and ignite enthusiasm about building a bridge between home and school that is populated with signage about the importance of ABCs? In the South, we say, if you feed them, they will come. But once you get them in the door, how will you get them to come back next time? Next slide, please. In my experiences, reaching out can be one of the most frustrating experiences for a school and individual staff members. Numbers are incorrect, addresses are ever changing, and no one ever returns a phone call. Sometimes we may feel that no one at home is engaging with that student. But remember, schools are comprised of a variety of family structures that have varying access to methods of communication. Is there a communication plan in the school and district that can be used to market engagement practices? And if not, what current methods of communication have the strongest impact? Please be cognizant that older guardians and parents are not as technology savvy as younger guardians and parents. Conversely, younger guardian and parents may prefer electronic communication to traditional flyers and mail. Next slide, please. Communication can be a way to bring parents in. But let's be honest, some parents and guardians could potentially believe that every time the school calls me, it's because my student is in trouble. Or a community organization or business could potentially believe that every time a school calls, they need a donation. And this is where the concept of bringing them in could negate these myths. Engagement practices and activities that foster an invitation to the learning environment provides insights into what occurs on campus. And those experiences could stimulate parents and community members to volunteer to support the next great effort on campus. These invitations should be disseminated to all stakeholders to provide the opportunity to celebrate school and student successes and progress. One of the most successful approaches to stimulate school engagement is to provide opportunities for parents and guardians to celebrate student and school success. In my experiences, some of the ideas that we have used to help promote these opportunities are showcasing student organizations or clubs during monthly parent engagement meetings, One of the most exciting things I ever participated in was a poetry night that provided the opportunities for students to showcase their poetic efforts during the poetry unit. But it also provided an opportunity for parent poets to unexpectedly share works of art from their personal collection. And it even brought out local poets to share how poetry helped them find their voice and perform selected award-winning pieces. I can honestly say that was a magical night to see students, parents, guardians, and the community as artists in appreciation and celebration. Actually many times I have had the opportunity to participate and help implement community resource fairs on various campuses that I've worked on. And this is an excellent opportunity to link the community to the home and school, as well as connect people to resources to address school and/or personal needs. During the spring, offering a community fair that focuses on opportunities for students during the summer demonstrated the school's investment in creating positive experiences for students outside the school walls, when our sphere of influence was a little less. It was a one-stop shop for summer camps and opportunities. Also in the fall, we offered tailgating events that linked the local college and university games to build community relationships and bring stakeholders together on our campus. Using these community events to target dialogue, efforts, and demonstrations around the ABCs could be a strategic move. For instance, have that student government association that sponsored and supported better attendance by students this year perform the attendance rep during the resource fair. Or have students that serve as peer mediators offer a student-led workshop for stakeholders about peer mediation and how their experience in that service has helped build a better campus culture on the campus. Or have your STEAM student teams demonstrate what they've created and how they engineered it to work. Sponsor an art show that demonstrates the gifts and talents of students. Allow students to demonstrate through a talent show their gifts and talents to the community. Have local tax preparers come during the spring to help families during tax season. Have students lead these meetings, which provides an additional layer of investment in attendance and interest for parents and guardians. Parents love to see their children lead. These Tier 1 opportunities open doors for parents to engage, invest, and find ways to act to support school and student growth. Next slide, please. Once that door is open, the ABCs can be used as a platform for focused conversation and dialogue on attendance, behavior, and course performance. ABC data can be used to demonstrate success, progress, and challenges to engage parents in conversations, ignite interest in change, and provide a space for voices to be heard. But that space is not enough. There must be a demonstration of how those words and ideas are used moving forward. A repeating agenda item at a monthly parent meeting I attended was real talk with a school leader. Every month, a different member of the administration would sit in a circle with parents and listen to their celebrations, challenges, and issues with the school experience. The school leaders then would report back to leadership teams about the topics discussed and concerns expressed. The following month, an update was given on how that information was used to determine next actions or to engage in further collaboration with parents to find an actionable means to address the challenge. In some cases, those circles yielded an opportunity and awareness of a morsel of greatness that went unnoticed and gave us an opportunity to celebrate it on a grander scale. Tier 1 activities that focus on ABCs or have ABC themes help to build a culture of focus on attendance, behavior, and course performance. They also lay a foundation for building understanding of and trust in school efforts. These pillars help to hold the community strong when challenges arise and provide a positive relationship to help tackle the tough issues when they present themselves. Parents who engage in the positive parts of school's experiences are more vested in protecting what is working to help their students and his or her classmates succeed. Now, when we're talking about reaching, next slide, please. When we're talking about reaching out in attendance, in my work in schools and with the ABCs, I've come across some resources that have helped identify ways to address attendance on campus. One of the best resources I have found is Attendance Works. Each bullet on the screen indicates a comprehensive resource available online that we use to address attendance in the school as well as outside the school walls. My Brother's Keeper and Success Mentors work in are another great avenue to help create a robust approach to attendance. One of the main components is a Success Mentor. Early warning systems seeks champions for students. If parents and community members are engaged in the school, Tier 1 efforts could potentially expand the pool of individuals available to serve as Success Mentors or champions in Tier 2 targeted approaches to attendance for students with early warning indicators. Next slide, please. When talking about bringing them in around behavior, I am a strong advocate of restorative practices, which has evolved from restorative justice and is a new field of study that has the potential of positively influencing human behavior and strengthening civil society around the world. Restorative practice build healthy communities, increase social capital, reduce the impact of crime, decrease antisocial behavior, and repair harm and restore relationships. This past week, I was working with a group of teachers who I had asked to identify 5 gross students who had multiple ABC concerns. Each teacher was tasked with creating a meaningful communication that would demonstrate belief in that student, despite the current struggles. During our feedback session this week, teachers beamed at the impact of this effort. Many of these gross students received multiple positive reinforcements in the last week, and their parent and guardian was given a nugget of something positive after a year riddled with concern for his or her student. Parents reposted teacher efforts on Facebook. One student commented, "Why is everyone being so nice to me?" That's an indicator of another issue, but on this day, he felt supported and valued. Teachers beamed from ear to ear as they retold these stories. And all of these restorative efforts to rebuild relationships in the class, with the home, and to cultivate a sense of belonging help kids realize they have a champion. Another way we addressed behavior at home was to really communicate with parents and guardians about what behaviors we were addressing in the school and how they could model those good interactions at home. No matter what part of society we're in, there's conflict. At home, there's conflict. Having conversations with your students, between parents and students, about how to handle those conflicts that arise at school and in life help to improve the culture on the campus. And it helps with the home modeling positive ways to express your feelings during conflict. Another resource we used was National Network of Partnerships in Schools, Promising Partnership Practices online resource. This resource provides a collection of best practices from schools around the country that build a bridge between home and school through targeted ABC-focused events. Here's a brief explanation of one event under the behavior category of this resource. The staff at Park Middle School in Kennewick, Washington recognize that labels, especially negative ones, are risky business. They may give the wrong impression about student abilities to succeed. For example, although they know that risk factors are definitely present in student lives, the educators at Park Middle School decided to classify all students as at hope and not as at risk. The concept grew from the national group called Kids at Hope that works to help students find their strength and have confidence in a bright future. Park Middle planned a Celebrating Student Success project to spotlight the various talents and abilities that put students at hope, including those with artistic, music, technology, and other talents. At Capitol Middle School, we adapted another practice to to build a partnership with the recreation department in Baton Rouge. And this partnership yielded an 8-week male mentoring program that focused on building connections to others through outdoor education and engagement. Many of the young men in this group had early warning indicators in behavior and had met multiple suspensions in their school experience. In an effort to avoid further suspension, this group was used as an alternative with a commitment requirement. The activity was the background to create a trusting environment and support system to address the challenges the student group was having. It truly was rewarding for students and adults that participated. In some cases, that engagement turned into summer employment for students with BREC. But the most important result was that connections were built. Young men were given the opportunity to learn different ways to approach conflict and struggle, and an unlikely support system of new friends was created for each individual that participated in the 8-week session. In terms of EWS, a web of champions was created to promote on-track behavior and foster positive school experiences. Next slide, please. When thinking about bringing them in on course performance, the big question is how to create opportunities for parents to support learning at the school. Some schools have deviated from traditional lesson planning to create a course syllabus issued at the beginning of the semester that outlines topics, assignments, due dates, and rubrics for grading formal assessment. This practice informed parents and guardians of the semester plan that could be followed at home. This contract between students, parents, and teachers was the accountability measure moving forward, not lesson plan review for leadership throughout the year. It eliminated any confusion about classroom expectations, pacing and learning practices, grading requirements, as well as provided a platform for parents to get involved or participate in the learning practice. At another school, parents are given monthly data updates in ABC language, and it is presented in similar ways that the teacher teams look at ABC data. This helped change the conversations at home about the experience. Traditionally, a parent of a supportive adult will ask, "How are your grades?" But changing the language of reporting information to parents and guardians helped change how they would inquire with their child. Instead of, "How are your grades?" it was refined to, "How are you doing in attendance? Did you make up your assignments when you were absent? How is your behavior in class? Is your attendance and behavior impacting your grades?" I must admit the school guided them on these questions, but it did change how conversations with parents and students were occurring. In talent development, the organization I work for, we promote the use of report card conferencing as a means of providing course performance support during the year. This practice provides students a caring adult to dialogue about ABC successes and challenges during the current grading period. At one school, they added another layer of engagement with parents in the process. After the report card conferences were held, students with early warning indicators were invited to lead a conference with their parents on what they had identified as behaviors that contributed to his or her off-track behavior, as well as identified the student steps he or she would be taking to address these challenges. In addition, a member of the staff would be the champion on campus for these modifications, and an invitation to the parent to be a champion at home for these positive steps was extended. This extension provided a foundation for improvement and success for all students that was reinforced on both sides of the bridge. Another variation of this is to provide tools and encouragement for parents to have periodic reflective conferencing about the ABCs at home. This is another way for students, teachers, and parents to build a bridge between the ABCs, student progress, and engagement in the student learning experience daily. Also, some schools, let me say that differently. I have worked with some schools that have used problem-based learning assignments to also engage parents in the learning process. One school used them as home challenges for extra privileges in the classroom or opportunities on campus. Parent engagement in the challenge was one of the 4 components of the experience And through enthusiasm, daily reminders, and communication of opportunities, teachers experience student work improvement and greater engagement of parents in the learning process. It also helps to share an understanding of the student experience and the expectations for learning. Once again, this helps build the bridge between learning at school and learning at home. At this time, that brings me to the end of my portion of this presentation. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to share my experiences in the field with you today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll turn it back over to the other facilitators.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Zerang. I would actually like to change it up a little bit for our question and answer portion. If our facilitator wouldn't actually mind going back to slide number 40 for me, and Jennifer, I would appreciate if you could stay off of mute while, because I would like to change our question and answer format to where we'll be talking about each individual part and having our participants bring in questions as you and I talk about each of these parts. I want to start out by saying that when it comes to these student showcases and bringing in parents into the building, one of my favorite best practices that you've shared with me is this idea of creating a chain of participation with parents. And what I mean by that, and because I don't think I've used that phrase with you before, is they'll come in for one event with something that their child is doing. So if their child is in band or doing the poetry, they'll come in for that because they want to see their child. And then you make the connection at that event to bring them in for the next one. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on that process that you have gone through, or please let me know if I need to describe it a little further to refresh your memory.
Well, I think I'll speak in reference to the community resource fairs. Initially, those started as just an opportunity to bring community organizations on campus, but we saw it as another opportunity to demonstrate what we were doing on campus, because we had a collective group of parents and students that were attending on a weekend so that parents weren't having to go to work. This is something they could do together. So we had food, we had opportunities for them to engage with each other, activities to engage with each other, but we also started to use that as an opportunity to hold workshops, to provide programming that would allow them to engage with what's going on campus, to let students demonstrate what they have been learning, or to demonstrate the gifts that they don't get to actually tap into in the classroom. All of these opportunities were also a place for us to layer in soft messaging about what was going on at the school, and softly give them opportunities to say, hey, I'd like to be a part of that. We also always had, whatever the next months of programming or events that were coming up, and we always had a volunteer sheet and an opportunity for you to designate what time you had available or what event that was coming up you could participate in. And before you knew it, the kids, especially like I said about the peer mediators, they were like, can we host our own workshop to entice new peer mediators in? And so that was something they came up with that we supported. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. If it hasn't, please clarify for me, Paul.
No, that was exactly it, that idea of that soft messaging to try and promote the other activities and to get from them the other activities that they would like to be a part of and to volunteer for. That in my mind, I was thinking of it as like a chain of events, as I would go to this one activity, and while I'm there, I'm invited to the next one. Even though my child may not be a part of it, I'm invited to the next one as like as a person to volunteer for. And it sounds like you've done further than that with that community resource fair to bring in their opinion and their need for what those resources and those workshops could be. So And I know our facilitator, if any questions do come in while we're talking through this, please interrupt as we're going, discussing each of these individual wonderful things that that Ms. Orang has done in her work with schools. So please feel free to interrupt with questions that come in. And participants, please feel free to add any questions you have in that chat area while we're talking about these individual things. So moving on to the next one, number 41, this idea of that parent voice. I think you kind of touched into that when you're talking about that, trying to get from them what workshops and what events that they would like to see. That talked a lot about the idea of, during this part you talked about, they need to see that, yes, you listened to me, but what is that impact? Like, yes, you heard me say that I need X. How do you then demonstrate to them that you used X to change or to support the school? How do you demonstrate that not only did you listen, but it made an impact on what you were doing?
For example, one of the concerns that we had heard over and over was the amount of homework that was going home. And part of that was a lack of communication, because the amount of homework the parents were perceived going home daily was actually a stockpile of work that kids had not accomplished in class, even though they were given the opportunity. So clarifying that was one thing that we did to address it. But the second thing was we started providing homework help during lunch and after school when kids were staying for other programming. And this gave the parents the opportunity to see that we were hearing them, that there was a lack of communication and understanding about the homework policy and what was expected of students, that we were layering another opportunity for us to support students, and that also helped them ask different questions when the student got home. It also started to breed an awareness of, per se, which classes had more homework than other classes. So it started to target what parents would ask at home, and then it also demonstrated to them there was another place on campus that students who may not have completed work in the class could have another opportunity with some supportive adults to complete those assignments and not be so inundated in the evening times with work.
That's perfect. That is exactly for myself, the example that kind of solidifies it for me as and then do you bring that work back to that meeting that you had to let them know that yeah, we heard your concern and this is how we made changes?
Well, we got to announce. Congratulations, your words and your voice helped us come up with a new idea that we'll offer on campus for your children, and it's offered at lunch and after school through this program, and please let us know if you would like to sign your kid up for that, and is there any other way that we can support you through the homework process, which yielded another different conversation. So in this direct example, the next month after the leadership teams and teacher teams came together, we could announce another action that the school was going to take to support families at home. And I think that effort demonstrated our willingness to go the next step, and that also promoted parents and guardians to take another step with their children.
Excellent. Before I move on to the next slide for questions, I wanted to give a space just in case a question had come through in the chat.
Hi, Paul. No questions have come through in the chat yet.
All right. Well, then I'll happily move on to the next, if we can talk about attendance, which, as you can see from my example, about what I, as a teacher, and what other teachers have said, if I could only get that student into my classroom, I could really make an impact, because I know that student, I could work with them. And so there, as a teacher, for me, there was always a disconnect between what I could do about attendance as a teacher. And I was wondering if there are some advice you could give about that mindset and overcoming that mindset that as a teacher, attendance is not something that I need to worry about. What I need to start worrying about is the moment that they show up and making sure from bell to bell everything that they have is engaging and supportive, and which I know is one of the strategies that I've heard you talk about in the past, is that engaging and supportive and safe environments are in and of themselves an attendance strategy. But what other advice might you give for someone like me who as a teacher had that mindset that wasn't a concern?
Or that you didn't have control over that concern, correct?
Correct. Yes, that it was an issue that I just fretted about, but felt like I was powerless.
So, in working with teacher teams who have had those similar feelings, one of the best practices that I use is to ask those teacher teams when they identify the kids who have concerns in attendance, is to do an attendance interview. Sometimes as teachers, or as educators, we may assume we know why they're not coming to school, or we may understand, or we may think we know all the challenges that are inhibiting that child from being there. But through attendance interviewing, you ask questions that allow them to demonstrate what really impacts them. You ask questions about what is the real problem, and if there's a supportive environment and a safe place for them to share that, they'll tell you the real concerns. For instance, I had a young man that said, you know what, nobody wakes me up, and I don't have an alarm clock. Well, the easy fix was to get him an alarm clock, which honestly worked. He just needed someone or something to wake him up in the morning, because this kid came to school every day. He was just late. I've, in the past, have had some parents that just worked different schedules, and it was hard for them to be there to ensure their kids got off. And so connecting them with someone on the street or someone they could trust that could kind of fill in for them in proxy was helpful. And that was an easy connection that worked for them, and they worked out at the home. But we kind of helped them make that connection with somebody that could be there in their eyes and ears when they were still at work. Some other things that I would say is we have to change mindsets of what's important in education, and attendance is coming to the forefront of that. But there's still that belief system is if you make good grades or decent grades, you're fine. So really changing how teachers and educators address attendance on a daily basis really changes how students think about attendance on a daily basis, which also, if you change how you address attendance with parents on a more consistent basis, changes how they address attendance on a daily basis with their kids. I am a firm believer in that attendance is the foundation for all school success, because, as you say, if they're not in the building, what can we do? So we need to figure out ways to get them in the building, and part of that is making the environment fun and engaging. But the other part is making sure that we emphasize attendance not just in the building, but we emphasize attendance at home with our parents.
Yeah, if all of the ABC research and even that very first study by Dr. Belfance so long ago, the title is about engagement. And you can't engage in something that you're not there to engage with. And so, yeah, it is that first step for any other engagement. It's that first step. So, again, I want to leave a space in case there is a question that has been put into chat.
Yes. Judy would like to know, where can we find a list of attendance interview questions?
Paul, would you like me to take that? Or I mean, we both can answer the question. We have a resource that we can provide that would give you some set questions that we use. I don't know if it is online, but I don't have a problem sharing it.
And I myself have used more of a survey type questions where to understand how the attendance is being, like why the overall attendance is going on in the building, you pick a couple of days and you interview everyone who is absent, or you survey everyone who is absent in those couple of days to find out why they were absent. And it's not as personal data, but it gives you an overall understanding of your school as to why they are, why your students in general are missing. So.
And like Paul said, that practice can be used for an individual student to identify an individual intervention, or it can be used on a greater scale to really look at those trends. We don't want as teacher teams and as schools to create interventions that don't speak to the needs of the students. So looking at that little snapshot for 2 days really kind of gives you an overview of what that daily experience is and what are the challenges to attendance. So using it in both ways, I have used it in both ways and found it to be very meaningful to drive decision-making and intervention conversations.
Space for any other questions that may have come through?
There are no other questions.
All right, then
One just came through. Have you all found any trauma-informed practices to be helpful in this work?
Have we found any, what practices?
Trauma-informed practices.
Ms. Rang, if you'd like to go first.
So I will say this, as part of one of the partnerships we worked with, we were lucky enough to have a social worker that really did that case management piece. And yes, those practices were used specifically with those case management pieces, but also with some of the targeted supports in a Tier 2 effort. But yes, absolutely, because one of the things that all of what we are supporting here is really building relationships, understanding our students and our parent experiences, and finding a way to fill those gaps. So yes, ma'am, I would say that they are, but I don't have a whole lot of experience. We were, like I said, lucky enough to have social workers who really navigated those worlds for us.
And my own experience as a teacher, trauma-informed practices are, again, what little experiences that I've had have been mostly around de-escalation techniques for my classroom, along with how to create those safe and engaging classrooms for those who have had those adverse childhood experiences or who are currently suffering from post-traumatic stress, that I'm not triggering those experiences.
And I will add that it was just because there was a need and we had access to a resource, but one of the things that did occur is a bus that was sponsored by one of the local hospitals that really supported positive mental health practices on school campuses. After a traumatic event happened in the community, they would come and provide those trauma-informed practices and supports. So it wasn't so much that it was built into the school that we had the personnel to do so, but then really reaching out and knowing that was a need, we found some entity that could service those students that were having strong emotional responses to something tragic that had happened. Throughout the year, it wasn't just for that one thing. They were contracted throughout the year to be there and continue to work with those students.
All right. Any further questions before we close out?
No, there are no other questions.
All right. For myself, if we move on to slide 45, I believe, I want to thank everyone for their participation today and for those questions. And to once again recap that bringing in parents into the early warning system process is about increasing that engagement, doing so in an efficient manner that you create that connection using your resources in an efficient manner that you that your connection is both case managed as well as project managed, and that you do that to build that personal connection between the people in the building who are working with the students and parents at home who both sides are concerned about the child's success, and that we acknowledge that concern and influence that we have and the limitations of that concern and influence. And then with that last slide, I do want to make sure that everyone understands that there is the support provided by the National Center to implement many of the things that we just talked about. Technical assistance support that gets sent out regularly. There's a form that gets sent out regularly during our newsletters to apply for that support, and that support can include implementing strategies that we talked about today. So be on the lookout for that form, and I'll be happy to we'd be happy to provide whatever support we can. So thank you again for your participation.
Thanks, Paul. I just want to thank everyone for attending today and hope that you found it helpful and informative. There is a link in the chat function. Just want you to pay attention to that link. It will bring you to our temporary website where all of our recorded webinars live.
All right, and thank you again, everyone, and have yourselves a great day.
Thank you, and have a good day.